I will. So I will tell you what the video said. It said that the first time I walked into Miller Son Bakery, I looked at the case, I ate something, and I was like, holy crap, these people are serious. Like Krista Glenny had said they were serious, and Krista is pretty much always right. So I was kind of prepared, but I was still shocked because you don't, in my experience, walking into new bakeries and trying things, find that level of finesse like right off the top. And when I say finesse, stuff that's supposed to be crispy is crispy. Stuff that's supposed to be buttery is buttery, and then I look and I find out Mr. Horton is grinding his own flour. And I'm like, holy, what level of dedication does it take somebody to be like, it kind of makes it worth it to me to actually produce my main ingredient that most people just get in bags. I'm like, this very serious dude. And then I tasted the Wonder Loaf, which is Mr. Horton's homage to Wonder Bread and the history of tying what his work is into the history of Buffalo baking. Wonder Bread was produced in Buffalo in large amounts from 1923. It tapered off. The factory closed in 2004. And when I bit into it, I would have to say untoasted, I didn't quite get it, but toasted, I bit into it and I had a ratatouille moment. And there I was at my mom's Formica table, and I was having the best peanut butter and jelly sandwich ever. And I'm like, wait. And this is the part I didn't get. I'm like, so wait, he's going to the trouble of sourcing and grinding his own flour, and he's doing this, and he fucking nailed it, and he's selling it for $6. This doesn't make any sense. So I thought maybe we could ask. And I mean, starting out with any place you want, but before we're done here tonight, Mr. Horton, please walk us through how you did that.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me, first of all.
Oh, hey, pleasure.
And when we moved to Buffalo, by we, I mean my life partner and business partner, Jill Colella, who in many ways is really the heart and soul of the bakery. We visited Buffalo in 2019. It was my first experience being here, and I'd come from Minneapolis, where grain also played a large role in its history and development. But Buffalo had a unique architecture and landscape in the silos. And what struck me was just how the silos dominate the landscape in a way that visually is very stunning. And I was taken with that. I love water. I love, Lake Erie is my happy place when I need to walk over by the pier at the Long Canal side, and even though it's not really quite the lake, but I enjoy everything about that. And anyway, my long way of saying, I wanted to somehow embrace part of that history and culture of food in terms of what Buffalo had represented. Now, the history of grain is very important here. Obviously, it's an understatement. But Jill had brought to the attention the whole idea of Wonder Bread. So we started to talk about that, and it was very important to her that we have a loaf that represented in some way an homage to Wonder Bread. And so I started with that. And once we started to play with different grains and knew what we were working with, we realized that we could make something that could get the kind of volume and texture that we wanted to create. We wanted it to have that richness, softness that Wonder Bread, I think I would assume many people from the youth had experienced, but our take on it. So using a somewhat local grain or New York-based grain, using butter and fermentation to really bring out that flavor and texture.
And I can only assume that after all this work, and you sell it for $6, is it a popular product for you?
It is. It is a popular. It's not our most popular bread. Sourdough by far is our most popular bread, but it is something that a lot of people gravitate towards. A pan bread also makes sense from a standpoint of an entry when you're not sure about what a place is, and you're maybe even not that familiar with sourdough, or what's a grain and seed loaf, or a baguette even. Pan bread at least has some familiarity to it, I think, for many people, and so it's a nice entry point. But it does sell well, and I think people respond well to it.
So I've met a lot of bakers. I've met few who grind their own bread. 5 Points Bakery being one of them here in Buffalo. Um, at what point did you decide as a baker, I've taken this so far, I need to take control of the flour? When
Yeah,
did you become a miller?
that was in 2015. I had sold my first bakery, and it was kind of, I was collecting myself, let's just say. I needed a pause. And one of the challenges we had in Minneapolis, like in many parts of the country, is sourcing ingredients, specifically flour, even though we had General Mills and Cargill. ADM had a plant or a factory in just over the border in Wisconsin. So there were options, but the options were a very limited range of what's available from a flour standpoint in the area. And so as I started to explore it, there were really only two options in my mind if I wanted to really experience a different type of flour and a different type of flavor profile from the potential, which was to source grain or flour from the West Coast or the East Coast, which is very, very expensive, or to try to do it myself. Go ahead.
If you could help us, so at that point, the flour that you could get your hands on, what did it not have that you wanted it to have?
It didn't have a lot of flavor. It had the most flour in the United States by large mills and even by universities that grow grain and then test it for varying characteristics. I mean, the primary thing that grain is tested for is yield and disease resistance, whether or not it lodges, specifically with wheat. But one of the things that is never tested is how does it taste? Now, when it gets to a professional company like General Mills or Cargill, they are factoring some of that in, but for the most part, they're looking for performance and consistency. Those are the big factors for them. So they do an amalgam of different flours to bring together a consistent product. The flavor is not really part of the equation in terms of what is the end product going to be produced. So what I would say is that there was a range of flours that would perform differently, from a lower protein to a higher protein flour and in between, but there wasn't anything that had a unique perspective. And for me, and that's an overarching theme in food, is that if we're all aiming towards the middle, then we're all really on our way down to the bottom. Because if we're all the same, then what's the difference? We can all put a different packaging on it. We can shine it up, but at the end of the day, it's just a race to the bottom, because then it's who can do it for the cheapest. And so I wanted to go the other way. How can I make this unique beyond process and technique, with fermentation and using sourdough methods or even commercially yeasted processes? How can I start with an ingredient that perhaps will be unique in itself? And so that's how I approached it and started to learn more about what that would mean in terms of processing and milling.
And eventually your search led you to look into terroir, like what difference does it make that something's grown nearby? I mean, terroir is a figure, and when people talk about different grapes grown for different vintages, the characteristics that the weather and the struggle of the plant, add something to the flavor. What did you end up doing there?
So we ended up, this is in Minnesota again, we ended up being able to source from primarily North Dakota, the northwestern part of Minnesota, and into South Dakota and Wisconsin as well. And we were able to discover a wide range of different types of wheat, rye, soft wheats, hard wheats, primarily spring, a little bit of winter. And what we were able to find is that first, there was definitely a texture difference in terms of milling your own fresh flour, but that the flavor perspective was very ranging. Specifically, if you looked at rye, that we were using this varietal called Hazlitt. To bore anybody with specific details, but it had chocolate cocoa notes that would come through in the bread that are very different. It's a very similar bread to what we're making at the bakery now. We do 100% rye bread here at Miller's Thumb, but we're using a land roast rye, which doesn't have a specific varietal, and It does not have those same flavor notes of chocolate. It's more grassy, earthy, nutty a little bit, but it is not chocolatey the same way. So there's just difference in terms of what's grown, how it's grown, the season, who's growing it, even those type of things. And I think that comes through in even in subtle ways. It comes through in the product.
You want to make the best bread that you know how. Are
Mhm.
you going to have to start growing your own grain?
No, no, no. That's a whole nother. I
Oh,
may
hey,
I
listen,
may be crazy, but I'm not that crazy.
uh,
The I
there's a
have
baker,
a family of farmers. No,
there's
no.
a baker in town, who I respect. Her name is Emily Savage.
Mhm.
She was one of the leading pastry chefs in the area dealing in white flour, refined sugar. She
Mhm.
literally got bit by a bug, Lyme disease, became
Mhm.
allergic to that stuff, and started researching ancient grains, local grains, and actually did get into has gotten into some production herself of some of the einkorns and things that she just couldn't find someplace else.
Sure.
Anyways, I don't mean to detour. So what I just wanted to say, it's not a completely nutty question I asked you, because for you to have control of the whole process, right?
You would. They're just, there are so many levels to farming and risk. I feel like Jill and I have taken enough risk with this business. Farming is a whole nother level in terms of things you can't control.
I have always seen a great kinship between farmers, people who make their living from the land, and restaurant people, because you can do everything right. I'll follow all your P's and Q's as smart as you can be. And then it snows or it rains or something happens, and you just got to deal with it. You got to get up the next morning and keep going.
Right, exactly. And we have enough challenges, so I'll leave the grain growing to the people that are very, very good at it. So
So I have to be honest, like when I hear about all the work that you put into your work, I walk into your bakery, I'm a fan. I'm not trying to shine your apple here, but I was like, $6. That's criminal. That's wrong. You should get more for that. But on the other hand, as someone who only recently started the first business of his life, I acknowledge that obviously, if you turn off your clientele, if you turn off your customers, if you get this reputation as an only ever once in a while place, you lose a lot that way. How do you find the balance between like crazy work you're putting into sourcing and getting and saying no sometimes and not having products sometimes because you can't get the right stuff,
right.
and a place where people will come back?
Yeah, that is a balance. And I'm glad that I have a business partner and Jill that reminds me that, we're not selling, we can't lace everything with gold, as she puts it. And we need to be thinking about the bottom line. Because my instinct is to sell it for enough for us to do okay, but to make it accessible, which is what we are doing. But it is a constant reassessment of what are our ingredient costs and how has a product gone in terms of sales, and are we justifying the labor that's put into it to make sense, or do we discontinue it? So we are constantly looking at that in terms of, is a fairly new business, still only a year old. We're not always sure how something will be received. But to answer your question, I mean, ultimately, it's really about accessibility and convenience. I mean, local bakeries, in my mind, are not necessarily destinations. They're really more convenience based. And if you don't have the ability to be accessible, be it with parking, visibility, perhaps neighbors, depending on where you are, and price point to some degree, and availability of product, those are things that are obstacles potentially. And so we're trying to remove as many of those obstacles as we can to make our product as accessible as it can be.
I'm going to ask you a blunt question.
Sure.
Do you lose money on each loaf of Wonder Loaf, or do you
No,
enough
no,
makes it? Okay,
no,
that's
no.
it. That's it. I was just look. I mean, it's amazing. See, one of the things that bothers me or drives me, I guess you could say, as a food journalist, is I live in a town where people will drive by your bakery and go someplace and spend more money for worse bread produced somewhere a long ways away, that's you know, that you would have thrown away a long time ago if it was as old as it was. And trying to just get people to understand what is right around the corner can be a little frustrating sometimes.
Sure. Yeah.
But
And
you gave me great ammunition, though.
well, that's good. That's good. Yeah. I mean, we struggle with that. I mean, in many ways, uh, I always think of grocery stores as our primary competitor. You know, I don't think of other bakeries as our competitor because I think there's room for all of us in the market. What we really face is buying habits that are geared around convenience, and you know, people, especially if it's snowing here or the weather is inclement in some way, they're not going to make as many stops. So again, that comes back to that whole obstacle issue. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, we want to be, you know, we want them to make that extra stop. Yeah. But you want to do something.
A question from audience member Scotty Harris. How do you deal with consistent gluten content with self-milled flour?
So that really comes down to process, technique, and adjustment based on the skills that we have. You know, so to answer your question more broadly and more specifically, as an example, the primary farmer that we or farming company that we use for a lot of our grain is Lake View Organic out of Indiana, so a couple hours east of here, and we get grain from them about once a month, every 3 to 4 weeks. And this last 4 months, 4 months is the harvest from 2023. And every time we get a grain delivery, it's a new lot. And every time it's a new lot, it changes. And so we have to adjust our hydration. We have to adjust our mix times. We have to adjust our fermentation times, how we handle the product, all to try to get that consistency that we're talking about. And we don't nail it every time. It's every day is a new chance to try to get it right. And so what we do is we just have to monitor what we're doing constantly by taking temperatures, making sure that we're understanding where our humidity is, all of that. And temperature is really, really important in bread baking, especially, and in confiserie. But knowing what your temperatures are and being able to maintain a consistent temperature throughout the process enables you to have a lot more consistency.
Alrighty then. So the pursuit of consistency, of course, is a baker thing.
Yeah,
People want to be able to know that if you liked Wonder Loaf one time, you should be able to come back in a week,
sure.
pick up something that's pretty much the same thing. And of course, since you're dealing in live organisms, in yeast and various other things, I mean, excuse me, there are so many things that can differ, but you have done the work, though, even though it's difficult to dial in it's more difficult to dial all these things in with the kind of product that you're insisting on using. You're insisting on using local organic stuff. You are willing to do more work because you want to use the materials you chose.
Right, exactly. And I think of things broadly, but I also think of them very narrowly. So for me, getting the product that we make, in a way, there isn't another way to do it. There is, obviously, there are multiple ways to do it, but I don't think of it that way. And so I just think, how can I make this work? And so with that perspective, I start, you know, if we have a problem, how do we address this problem? And move forward. Because to me, what's very important is to try to really express through our baking what the taste of New York is, and as much as we're able to. So we use a company called Regional Access, based near Albany, and they distribute a lot of mainly New York products, but not exclusively. And so we're using eggs of that are raised in New York to all of the grain. So we're as examples. So we're really trying to bring all of those flavors, support as much as we can local producers, and try to bring all of that kind of through and true in the taste and texture of the products that we're doing. So, I mean, that's where it kind of starts, and hopefully we're executing that on a daily basis.
I mean, when you told me about your journey to being a miller, not just a baker, your pursuit of being able to control and understand things that allows you to make those adjustments today in Tonawanda, I mean, started a long time ago. You told me about spending time with a guy who builds flour mills, right? Learning how the different parts of the mill and everything and which kind of things is better. I mean, that's the level that it takes, I guess. Does it?
I mean, it depends on resources and what you're trying to do. Sure. I mean, it does in terms of what we're doing, because what we're actually milling in terms of quantity is quite small. You know, the average mill in the United States mills 1 million pounds of flour a day. We mill 200 to 300 pounds a day. So we're beyond a micro mill. You know, the place that I opened in Minnesota is called Bakersfield in 2016. When we were milling about 12 to 1,500 pounds of flour a day. Again, a very small mill, much larger than what we're doing here. But in order to understand what we were trying to achieve, we needed to understand our equipment a little bit better. We also found very early that we had a lot of problems. The first month was a lot of experimentation, and in the first few months we had a lot of failure. Because the grain in Minnesota specifically and in North Dakota is very hard. Much harder than what's grown in New York, for example. It's primarily spring wheat, and we needed to adjust how we milled. We had to slow things down. We tried tempering at one point, which is to soak the grain overnight. So we tried all these different methods until we were able to figure out a way to get the type of flour we wanted to produce the type of bread that. So there was a lot of trial and error, which informed my ability now to do what we're doing here in town.
If I recall correctly, was this when you discovered that what you actually needed to do, the fix, the tweak, was to actually slow it down and grind it more slowly so it didn't heat up, destroy the
Yeah,
starch?
it was partially, yes, it was to slow it down, to slow the whole process down, the speed of the stones, the gap in the terms of the gap ratio between the stones, the grain feed, everything had to be slowed way down. That capacity of that mill is about 500 pounds an hour, and we went down to about 120 pounds an hour in order to achieve the type of flour that we needed. And what was happening, as you said, was we were ending up with way too much starch damage, and that was causing everything to ferment way too fast and was not holding enough elasticity in terms of the products. So there wasn't enough buoyancy, and you couldn't keep the structures that you wanted. So it was a painful learning process, but we were able to eventually get where we needed to be.
But having gone through all this trial and error, having the benefit when you need to diagnose something that's not working the way it's supposed to, you have the benefit of that.
Absolutely, yeah. And the grain here has been much easier in some ways to manage from a change standpoint because it is so much softer. I don't ever have to really worry about getting the type of starch damage that we did in Minnesota. So that's a great starting point. But we're also able to produce flour that enables us to do products that I think are better than what we were producing in many cases in Minnesota, mainly from a texture standpoint, different from a flavor standpoint. So that's not really better necessarily, it's more subjective, but I would say texture wise, I can get a much wider range of products than I was able to in Minnesota.
I recall initially it was you're grinding almost all of the flour, but you were still using some flour from elsewhere for like the finest vinoiserie.
Yes.
Did you dial that in, or
No, we're still not found a grain that works for what we're trying to do with vinoiserie, because our process is fairly long and there are so many different steps to it where we see deterioration from the flour that we're milling ourselves. And the product just didn't get the same kind of pop in the oven. The texture wasn't right. So we are using a King Arthur flour for that. That's the only thing we don't mill ourselves. Yeah.
If you would, roughly, what percentage of the flour do you go through at Millerstown? Do you mill yourself at this point?
Let's see. That's a great question. I should know this off the top of my head. So we're probably using a little under 2,000 pounds a week roughly of flour combined, and about 250 pounds of it is King Arthur flour. So,
Okay.
so what is that? That's a little 15% maybe is
Yeah.
conventionally grown and or commercially produced, and then the rest of it is made ourselves.
And all of the rest of the stuff that comes out of your place
Mhm.
comes from grain that comes in sacks. And
Mhm.
in your place, there's like essentially two rocks, or at least one rock that's spinning,
Two rows. Yeah, yeah.
and you're feeding it grain down a tube,
Mhm.
and you get flour out the other end, and you make all that stuff.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, Willy Wonka got nothing on you.
Yeah, we have a lot of brands. So if anyone wants brand, is a byproduct. So we end up with brand flakes, and we have a couple of people that pick up, primarily a chicken farmer in the area. They pick up every 2 weeks, and they use it and make a paste with it and give it to their chickens.
A little bit of parts of the grain 101, please, for people who are not familiar.
Oh, sure, sure. Sorry.
So you at Cargill, you were getting white flour that had a whole bunch of stuff that got taken away before it got to you, but maybe you could help us with that.
Sure. So most, let's say conventional bread flour, for example, it's going to be 68, 70% endosperm. So you have a grain, wheat kernel, is primarily endosperm, there's germ, and there's bran. Those are the three main components. There's smaller parts of that. But anyway, and the bran can be 25 to 30% of the grain. And if you're buying a bread flour that is conventionally produced, generally all of that bran has been removed and the germ as well, partially for
So
safety, but to make it white to some degree.
is it fair to say that the germ is like a little bit of a little bit of a core, like maybe the greens part in a garlic clove, and the bran is kind of like a rough coating? Is
Yeah,
that
exactly.
fair?
That's a good way to think of it. And the germ is really where the oils, flavor, minerals, everything is. Not all the minerals, but a lot of that is combined right there in the germ. The bran also has a lot of minerals in it, but it's primarily there, as you said, a protective covering, but also to add fiber to the product. So when they mill, when a conventional mill takes away that through roller mills, they strip it all away. And if they make whole wheat, they just put it all back together. So those different particles are different sizes. What we do is we do a single pass through, and so we're able to produce a flour where about 80 to 82%, depending on which screen, we have different screens that are removing. But generally for our bread flour, we have about 80% extraction. So that means that we have all the endosperm, and some bran and the germ has been maintained in the flour. So our flour is a little more like cream color, almost tan in some ways, but it also has a little bit more of the nutrients and flavor components. And so that's kind of the primary difference. So it's
And as something that has more of the germ in it, and the germ having oils in it,
mhm.
there's also more of a potential for potential spoilage because oil can spoil. So you have to take a little more care of it, right? That's the reason they take it out, because it makes it more shelf stable.
Yes, exactly. Even though now they're able to heat treat the germ in many ways, when they combine it back in and make a whole wheat flour, it's been treated in a way that makes it more stable. But yes, many years ago, that was one of the primary reasons for moving, was because of storage issues and spoilage. We mill almost every day, except for Sundays usually. And we're using the flour within 48 hours. Now we sell flour as well to our retail customers, but we encourage them, if they're not going to use it within a week or two, to refrigerate it or freeze it, to help keep it, shelf life a little bit more longevity to it.
Yeah, it's a more delicate material. It was not bred for storage.
Right.
Bread.
Exactly.
Aha, see what I did there.
Um,
I mean, one of the other things I wanted to ask you about, I mean, from the beginning, I started talking to Jill about, this idea of tying the bakery into larger community things. And I guess it strikes me that if you're insisting on buying wheat that was grown in New York, you're putting your money back into where you are.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's the idea of a grain economy to some degree, which is in a way an odd thing to think about. But if we're supporting farmers that are growing grain that is not only interesting but in a sustainable way, perhaps organic, depending on their perspective, uh, we're helping to keep them going. And from what we've been told, so Lakeview Organic, like I mentioned, they have a processing arm of their whole operation is called Seneca Grain and Bean, and they are, from my information, have told me that what we're buying is, so most of their grain that they sell is in large super totes, so 2,200 to 2,500 pound totes. But what we do is we get our grain in 50-pound bags, and from information Peter, who owns the company, told me that we're their largest customer. So that's really gratifying, because what that means is we're able to support them and they're able to support us. And by doing that, they're continuing to do the things that they do and hopefully expand at some point. I mean, we're a small part of that, but at least that's the idea, is to help continue and further. Because again, if it comes back to, if everybody's selling their grain to commodity and it all gets amalgamated into conventional process that has really no factor in terms of flavor, then we're all eating the same thing, literally, as opposed to figuratively.
So you mill your own things. Is there, I know among farmers who raise animals, especially larger ones, there's a bit of a lack of federally licensed appropriate abattoirs, that the animals can go from the farm to retail cuts without having to be trucked someplace else. I mean, are there any sort of regional mills that are doing this sort of thing around here?
Well, so there is one of our other grain suppliers is Farmer Brown, which is based further east in New York. They're actually quite a large flour producer, primarily selling in the New York City area. They're also selling their grain through regional access, and they're a fairly large size, and they're partially owned by a farmer. So the farmer has a collective of a few people that he works with, and he grows the grain along with his other farms, and then they ship it off to their mill. And so they've really kind of, what you were talking about, they've created a lot more vertical integration in the process. But they're the largest of the one I know in the area, but they're still quite small, relatively speaking. But there are more local grain and mills, I should say, growing in the United States than there have been in the last 20 years. So it's, I think, a very interesting time. More bakers are kind of interested in that, or millers are interested in getting into it. People are interested in becoming millers. And Vermont is kind of has a couple of those places, Elmore Mountain specifically, which is one of the places I visited early on to learn about milling on this level.
I understand that you're not a farmer. I would not ask you to speak for them, but you talk to a lot more farmers than I do at this point, especially grain people. Have you gotten the sense, I know there has been a hope for years that the rising interest in heritage grains, your einkorns and your ancient grains and the not the same old genetic grains, would eventually filter down to the local farmers who would be able to find a higher value crop than the same old acre of commercial stuff. And if you don't know, that's fine, but I'm just wondering, have you any inkling that that's actually happening? People are being encouraged to grow more spiffy things because it makes business sense if they can get more money for it, if the market's there.
I can't speak to it as much here in New York, because I beyond like the organic, I don't know that many farmers here. But in Minnesota, there was a diversity of crops being grown, primarily for the point that you're emphasizing, which was to try to create more revenue for themselves. The difficulty becomes in the heritage and the ancient grains, as they're labeled. Those crops, those grains don't yield as much. So when you start to talk about modern wheat that yields 150 bushels to an acre or 170 bushels to an acre, and you grow einkorn or you grow red fife, which is a heritage grain, turkey red, and you're getting 35 to 45 bushels an acre, the math starts to become problematic in terms of who's your customer and how do you make that work. The other aspect to it is some of those grains are difficult to grow because of moisture specifically. So where they're grown, is difficult. But yeah, I think there is, I should say, another thing, not to get on a soapbox, but the Farm Bill does not help the small farm. It is specifically designed to help agribusiness. And so it subsidizes very, very large operations in many ways, in my opinion. So when you start to look at sustainable farming or diversity of farming. It's a tough slog, in addition to all of the other factors that you already mentioned, weather, equipment, land, etc.
Well, then I guess we should count our blessings that we get any of the interesting stuff at all, really. I mean,
Is yes.
so
It's challenging.
before we move on, I was wondering if you mentioned eggs and obviously grain. Are there other local things? I mean, you can't get enough local butter, right?
Right. Well, we're using we're kind of playing with different butters right now. No, most of our butter is produced out of Pennsylvania. It's a we use two different companies, but we're using Pittsburgh Dairy, so we use their cream half and half. They're just outside Rochester, I believe, and so that's one aspect. Pumpkin seeds. So one of our grain and seed bread has pumpkin seeds in it. That's actually one from New York. So that's another nice product to have. We're using all of our tea and chai that we buy is from Hardy and Sons. Now, none of the tea is obviously grown here, but we're trying to use local suppliers, or at least within the state of itself, to kind of, I think, celebrate in many ways what is here. We go to the farmers markets and buy apples and different produce as much as we can. So we're trying to be good stewards of what's available here.
You know, one of the things I wanted to ask you about that you actually do know something about is being the recipient of a James Beard Award nomination.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for those who don't know, the James Beard Awards are the national restaurant, bakery, beverage program, hospitality, and food media awards. That's it. So anywhere in this country, if a local operation gets recognized on the semi-finalist nominee, which is the broadest list, because it's going to get winnowed down to finalists, and then the winners are announced in Chicago. That semi-finalist list is about as much recognition as any place outside of the major burgs is ever going to see on a national level, partly because there's not much else, but also because they have over the years made a point of trying to find places, trying to do the work of finding excellent talent outside LA, Chicago, Manhattan. So and I wanted to bring this up because this year, for the first time, two restaurants in Buffalo, New York have been honored. Waxlight Bar of Inn, 27 Chandler Street, nominated for the second time for an outstanding beverage program. Their food program is outstanding as well, extremely creative. On Southern Junction, Ryan Fernandez's blend of Carolyn and Texas barbecue also got a nomination for Fernandez as emerging chef. So I looked up the last time Minnesota got, Minnesota this year, I think has, I don't know, a dozen places on the list. And you were nominated 3 times, is that correct?
I think so. I should know that. I think it was 3, yeah.
So for a lot of people in Buffalo, including myself, there's no point in asking, what can a James Beard nom do for you? And should people expect something? But you, sir, actually know what you're talking about. So I thought I'd ask you, what kind of impact can that kind of have? And, obviously tailored to your observations of how Buffalo may be different than the situation you were in Minneapolis.
Sure. I mean, personally, what I can say is that I wasn't very familiar or very versed in what the James Beard Awards were. I was aware of them, but I didn't know. And it was a surprise to me when I was nominated the first time. And it was a surprise, and it was also interesting at the time because my business was doing well, my first bakery, Rustica, but we suddenly saw a bump that we didn't really see or know about or expect. And And so from a personal standpoint, I think it can be very helpful to a business or a chef or some, depending on what their category is. You can definitely see it, not just throughout the process, but if you're lucky enough to win as well. That's one aspect to it. But in a broader sense, I think, it goes to your main point that you started with is it helps to bring about a recognition to the food scene in that particular area. And by bringing that national attention, because Minnesota, which somewhat is similar in Buffalo, it's considered flyover country. It just is. And the Twin Cities are in many ways very cosmopolitan, and whatever that word actually means. But there's many different types of cultural aspects to Minnesota that are fantastic. But if you ask most people that I've met from New York City, they have very little awareness of what goes on in the Midwest, and to some degree that's understandable. But my point being is that there's New York, there's Chicago, there's LA, and everything else in between is just there. And so it does bring about an awareness, because now national media, they need to write about something, they need to talk about something. And so by putting it in front of them now, they've brought more awareness to it and more eyeballs through that. But ultimately, so I think that's a good thing. But ultimately, I think it always comes back to this food scene in that particular area. It is incumbent on bakers, chefs, people in business owners, for us to continue to push what we do, have a perspective, to work hard at that. It's not just exploring what that perspective is, but to bring it to the consumers, to the public in that area, and to raise the level of what we do. Because if we don't do that, then the recognition is all great, but then we're just kind of spinning our wheels. Ultimately, it's about hospitality, and we're about service. No matter how good or not good the products are, we have to be thinking about the public and what they want to some degree. I mean, you still have to have your perspective, but I think you have to be able to bridge the gap between what is expected and what is it possible. And so the beards are great, and I think that it is a fabulous way for some recognition, but it's just a piece of the pie in a sense. If you look at the total kind of landscape of what needs to happen for food, I think we have to just always look back at ourselves, because that's what we can control.
Well, along the lines of what can we do here to broaden the sense of Buffalo as a food town beyond chicken wings, which everyone has heard of, pizza and beef on weck. Jill mentioned to me an idea that you guys were kicking around for. I guess what she said was, why doesn't Buffalo have a museum of food?
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us a little bit about that idea?
I can. I mean, this is Jill's idea. This is her project that she wants to bring to fruition at some point. But the Buffalo has a very unique food history in my mind, and as you're well aware. And the story of shipping in a grain, and specifically, and all of the other elements, and even to some degree immigration. If you start to look at that and what it has meant, I mean, the Wonder Bread factory we were talking about wasn't just a Wonder Bread factory; it was a Wonder Bread and snack factory that supplied all of those products for the entire East Coast. Buffalo was a necessary and important part of the food chain in the whole eastern part of the United States and into the Great Lakes in general. And so that history, I think, needs to be celebrated and told. And in many ways, it's fragmented, right? It's so much of it, like anything, people don't even know. And when you're near something or you live in it, you don't always appreciate it or know it. And I think that museum that she wants to eventually bring to reality is talking about that history, but it's also talking about not just the history. It's talking about what is the food today. What does that mean? What is the history of everything from Twinkies to high-end artisan bread to chef-driven restaurants? There's a range of food, and Jill sees kind of all the possibilities of that and wants to celebrate it.
See, I would certainly spend entire days there wandering around, but then again, that's me.
Right.
if I get into the wrong grocery store, by which I mean a grocery store I've never seen before, filled with things I've never seen before, time can stop. People send me texts, where are you? You know, it happens. So I figure, hey, I mean, oh, right, the grain transshipment, you have bread. What else is made out of grain? Beer, you know, and all the things that grew around that.
Mhm.
There is so much about Buffalo's actual culinary history. I think that would be really surprising to people. Like,
Abs-
um, I think the earliest photograph I saw of a Chinese business person opening a Chinese grocery store, and it was a nice one. It was from the late 1980s. Sorry, 1890.
Okay,
I
okay.
was like, oh, 19, no, from the 1890s. And I just think a lot of people don't think of Buffalo's history that way.
Mhm.
There was a lot of people moving through Buffalo. There are places to go, people to see. And the way that contributed to the things that the people here had to eat, obviously. Uh, I mean, that's its own story.
Right.
So let me turn the tables on you a little bit here. And what do you want to know about, you know, Buffalo food? There must be something, because here's what I know about bakers. Among the restaurant species, bakers are the hermetic, almost monastic ones,
Mhm.
who are always up at hours no one else is doing with their incantations and their voodoo magic. Uh, they're either solitary people or they crack. And you've made it, so you must have learned how to be alone. So what I'm asking is, since you're the guy who probably doesn't get out that much running around restaurants, I'm going to assume, is there anything you've been looking for? Because you've done so much for us. I'm just trying to do you one solid here.
Oh yeah, you know what? I've tried a few Indian restaurants. I won't say which ones, but um, I have not found one that I would consider a, uh, one that I want to go back to. And so I'd be curious. I love Indian food. I know that's a very broad spectrum of cuisine, but I have
Two, rec
not.
two recommendations right now. And if you've been to either of these places, I apologize. Downtown across from the medical campus, Buffalo Tikka House.
Okay, I've not been there.
Buffalo Tikka House now has a chef who used to work in Manhattan running an whole operation, but had to work for a restaurant that didn't sell alcohol because it's haram and it bugged his wife. So he works in Buffalo now and really outstanding. Bangladeshi end of Indian.
Okay,
The other place I have to bring to your attention is Nalai Banana Leaf, Nellai space banana space leaf. That is at Main and Transit in Clarence.
okay,
First brought to my attention by one Janice Schlau. It has turned out to be a boon to the community because unlike most of the Indian places in town, which are dominated by a Northern Indian best hits, lots of curries and stuff, uh, they are, Nalai Banana Leaf is a Chettinad restaurant. Chettinad is an area in the South India, so they are Southern Indian specialists. Broad strokes here, more sourness, more, I would say more vegetables, and they have a mastery of dosa, idli, upatham, all of the Southern Indian things that are delightfully different than the Northern Indian thing.
right, right. Well, I'll have to try both of those. I appreciate that. I haven't been there,
I,
but you are correct. I don't get out. When I saw you last at Southern Junction, that was the last time I was out. So was
well, maybe we can do something about that. So there are people here who have been listening to all of this, and I just wanted, I could go on. I do have a million more questions, but first I want to just take a break here and see if anybody wanted to type stuff in and to the chat, which you're always able to do. And since I don't see any takers, I've got a few questions. So what's next for Miller's Thumb, the operation? Are you just in a hunkering down, we got it going, let's just do the work, or are you itching to do more?
yeah, we're trying to figure out our next steps. I mean, we've mapped out different avenues depending on how the first year went. And
How'd
what
the
I
first year go?
It went well. It went really well. You know, the last month's been a little more challenging with the weather, especially, but the first year went really well. And what we're thinking about doing is, because we're only open 5 days a week, and one of the complaints we get, of course, is that we're never open. Um, so what we've thought about doing, and we're trying to think about the actual mechanics of this, is to offer a subscription-based small menu limited to certain areas, like perhaps like Clarence, for example, or maybe even a part of the South Towns where we go to once a week, and we have a subscription and we do a drop off
Oh,
place with a partnership somewhere, you
you
know.
like a visit from the bread fairy. That would be
Exactly.
nice.
Yeah. And so that
All
would
right.
be a little bit wider reach. We could
Sure.
do a little bit more production volume on the slower days. And so that's been kind of that's what we're exploring right now.
Well, I guess I should pass on to you something that a friend of a friend told me after I turned them on to Miller's Thumb, because lately, when I want to just take advantage of people, I show up with a box of Miller's Thumb and I'm like, hey, and they're like, where's this from? And then they like me. So I went to a party and I brought a box of your stuff, you know, the assorted killers, the Kunaman, the sticky bun, just murdered them. And 2 weeks later, a woman comes up to me at a party and says, you son of a gun. I'm like, what? She's like, you hooked me on Miller's Thumb. Now I have to go back there every week. And I'm like, hey, baby, the first taste is for free. After that, ride's on you. But you are, what is your experience in terms of repeat customers? I mean, I understand it's an important part of the business, but what do you see in there in Tonawanda?
Well, I don't see a lot because I'm always in the back, but from what Jill has told me,
True.
we do have, I would say, a really high percentage of our regulars come once, twice, 3 times a week. So that's incredibly. There's so much gratitude for that. The town of Tonawanda specifically, but even into northern Buffalo, you know, the Kenton area in general has been so supportive of us, and so we were originally wanted to open in the north towns. You know, we looked in the south towns a little bit, but we're glad we did. We opened where we did, and I would say a good percentage of our customers are repeat customers. We on the weekends we'll see people that we don't have never seen before. They're giving us a shot because obviously people have a little more time on their hands. They're willing to travel a little bit more. But yeah, we've and part of the reason why we've opened Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. Now we're open at 7. We keep moving our time up a little bit. Was to help with the commute, or not help, but hopefully encourage people to stop by on their way to work. So by being open at 7, we're able to hopefully do that a little bit.
Well, all right. That is delightful. I'm looking at the clock. It's almost 7:30. Your hour-long tour of duty almost having ended. You should have a chance to say anything else that you might not have gotten to that you want to say.
Well, you know, I could say that I'm I've referenced it multiple times, but Jill really is the heart of the bakery. And if you come in, you'll see her most of the time. She's up front somewhere. Um, but we are, and she tells people this all the time, and it's genuine. We are so thankful that the town has received us in a way that has allowed us to continue and to hopefully continue to grow. And I appreciate that you know, all of the years of what I've been doing are being seen. And thank you for this as well as another chance to hopefully have a little few more people, you know, at least hopefully come in their doors and experience what we do. You know, whether they like it or not is a whole different thing. But yeah, we're grateful that we have this chance, and we're just trying to capitalize on that.
I bet you don't get a lot of customer complaints about the taste and flavor of things, or is that not the case?
Not too much.
Not
We
too much. Yeah.
occasionally do specifically about coffee. But the biggest thing we have complained about is the length of the line, not enough parking, and our hours. Those are the things that we hear about. So we need to be open longer. We need to be open every day. There's not enough parking, and the line's too long. So
I have
So
to tell you, nothing delights me like driving by and seeing that there's no place to park. And then you walk in and there's like 3D chess eye battles going over who's going to get the next table and somebody's get it. Have you ever had to call the police to quell disturbances over who's going to get the next table? Because that is the point, and that is the whole being of a successful place. A place that people are willing to fight to get into. And thank you, and Jill, for making that.
yeah, absolutely. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thanks for having us.